Hey y'all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the Boost Mobile Celero5G tablet. This is a relatively affordable Android tablet that sells for $200 as an exclusive for this carrier, and you can also pick up plans including their $20 unlimited data, granting you access to 5G unlimited connectivity when you're on the road or using this device outside of home. And so that is a point of distinction compared to many other Android tablets that we've seen at this price range in the past. Most of the budget offerings won't have cellular connectivity like this one. It actually supports a hybrid nano SIM card slot that can be also used to expand the built-in memory using a micro SD card, in addition to having eSIM support as well for staying connected, plus the typical, of course, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth are going to be built in as well. Now, aside from 5G connectivity, the tablet also has, I would say, reasonable specs in this price range, including a metal build that feels a little bit more premium than I expected, thanks to the aluminum alloy chassis. There's just a plastic band on the very top here to improve on the wireless antenna reception. Here it is next to something like a base iPad, and this actually is a fair comparison because both of these tablets are around 11 inches in terms of their screen size. However, we can see that the iPad is a little bit more boxy with its more squarish aspect ratio compared to a more widescreen 16:9 aspect ratio on the Celero5G tablet. And speaking of the screen, it is a fully laminated, full HD resolution, 90Hz fast refresh rate panel, IPS LCD. In fact, most budget tablets tend to only have a standard 60Hz panel, so this just feels a little bit more responsive as you're scrolling up and down. In fact, the base iPad is still 60Hz as well, despite being around $100 to $200 more. Colors are actually quite vibrant as well, and this default wallpaper is also giving me some Xperia vibes. Some of the Sony products that they made in the past, I think, had kind of a similar aesthetic going on, which isn't a bad thing in my opinion. It looks very elegant and more premium than the price here would imply. Bezels are also reasonably slim. Up top, there's a 5-megapixel webcam, and on the rear, there's actually two cameras, but really just the primary 13-megapixel lens is going to be the most useful one, and also a secondary 2-megapixel depth sensor for portrait effects. And there's also an LED flash that could be useful if you're scanning in documents in darker environments. Now, there isn't a keyboard case nor a stylus input, but I think that is mostly expected for this price point. Located on the left and right edges are also going to be built-in stereo speakers, giving you some added immersion when you're listening to music if you don't want to use wireless Bluetooth, and there is a standard 3.5mm headphone jack as well, always nice to see, plus Type-C for charging up the 7,500 milliamp hour capacity battery at around 20 watts, taking roughly 2 hours is also not bad. And then last but not least, in the very top, you'll find access to the power key volume rockers. These are all etched in metal as well. Now, one function that is missing, though, would be a fingerprint scanner, although there is face unlock using the front-facing cam, though technically not quite as accurate as something like an iPhone with 3D depth sensing. So that would have been nice to see, maybe in a next generation revision. You can always use a password or PIN, however. Now, before we dive deeper into the performance and take a closer look at that Android 15 operating system, just wanted to highlight a few more top-line specs. Now, the tablet is actually rated for IP52, splash and dust resistance. So if you get it accidentally wet or if it's raining outside, it should still survive. And that is because the SIM card slot also has a rubber gasket coating on it to prevent water from leaking in. A nice touch that, again, we seldom see on budget tablets, making it a little bit more durable. Again, the Celero line, as a refresher, is basically Boost Mobile's in-house line of products. Previously, they made the Celero5G smartphones. Price to performance ratio was actually quite high if you're looking at an entry-level device located in the US and wanted to try out Boost Mobile service. So this is continuing that lineup, but now making a tablet, again with cellular connectivity as well, offering a pretty attractive design overall. Now here's a final look at all of the specs. Feel free to pause and take a closer look. I would say the one part that they might have cut some corners on to reach the lower price point would be the RAM, however. The base model is 4GB, which in 2025 would have liked to see at least 6GB, if not a little bit more, since apps do tend to use a little bit more resources. But for a $200 device, I would say it still mostly gets by, as long as you aren't doing ridiculous amounts of multitasking, that is. Now, in terms of the processor, it's running on the MediaTek MT8755, which is an octa-core chip clocked at 2 GHz, and in my real-world usage, I would say it's quite similar to something like a Helio G99 in terms of offering good enough performance to get you by as an entry-level tablet. Of course, it's not going to be a flagship killer, such as besting the latest Snapdragon 8 Gen Series 8 Elite chip, but there's a huge difference in price, and I would say for the type of consumption that you're using this for, browsing the web, music streaming, and light gaming, it should still get you by. Otherwise, in the packaging, you will find just the charger as well as USB Type-C cable, with some of those aforementioned specs reiterated in the Cloud Silver colorway. Additionally, if you're picking it up to use with their unlimited 5G data plan, you'll get the SIM card as well, in addition to a quick start guide, and also a SIM card ejector is included here as well. Closer look at the software experience next. Thankfully, it's a relatively clean launcher in terms of the Android experience, actually quite similar to something like a Google Pixel tablet, and that means it's relatively faithful to what stock Android will look like. That being said, as a carrier-specific device, you will still find a handful of bloatware-related apps on here when you first take it out of the box, but thankfully most of those apps can be uninstalled or disabled if you aren't interested in them. It includes a couple of games and titles like Monopoly Go here, some puzzle games, but as aforementioned, you can simply uncheck these if you're not interested, taking just a couple of minutes to uninstall or clean up some of the apps that you aren't using, leaving you with an experience that looks something like this. Again, overall fluidity when it comes to navigating around the UI is also not bad, thanks to that octa-core chip and the 90 Hz refresh rate screen. One thing that is a little bit different versus other tablets I've seen recently, though, would be on the left side of the homepage, we have the Google Entertainment Space for streaming back videos, using YouTube, Hulu, Twitch, as well as Amazon Prime, things like that, as compared to the usual newsfeed that we see on most other smartphones. But I think this decision mostly makes sense because this is a larger screen tablet. You're probably using it for media consumption anyways, also taking advantage of the available 5G connectivity. You can be streaming anything when you're traveling instead of only being tethered to Wi-Fi hotspots, which, speaking of, this can be used as a mobile hotspot connecting up to 16 other devices if you want to use it like a mini router, so you can then connect your laptop or your phone to this to access data as well. And to Boost Mobile's credit, reception quality has been surprisingly strong here in the Seattle region. I was getting almost full bars, in most cases even indoors. Here's a quick internet speed test just to serve as reference, again using 5G connectivity, and we can see it's going to be more than fast enough for the purposes of web browsing, getting over 300 megabits per second, even faster than most Wi-Fi home networks, depending on the tier or membership that you're on. The upload speeds will be a little bit slower, but overall still plenty usable, again especially for media consumption. And with that, let's jump into the advanced settings to take a closer look at any customization that Boost Mobile have applied. Right away under network, you're able to download a virtual eSIM, maybe if you're traveling internationally, and under battery, you're able to turn on optimized charging, so to extend on the battery health, it will charge to only around 80% if it detects that you're plugging it in for longer durations. And in terms of battery life, the 7,500 milliamp hour capacity cell is also doing a pretty solid job, even with things like location services, aka GPS, plus 5G connectivity. I even use this for some navigation and GPS in a car with the screen brightness set to 100% and also playing back, streaming some music over Bluetooth. So pretty much turning on all of the wireless options, it was still able to last me through easily 6 to 7 hours of heavy use with 5G and max screen brightness before I had to recharge it again, and still had around 10 to 20% of battery left over. So the optimization is done quite well, and even in those extreme conditions, the tablet only got slightly warm, never got too hot or uncomfortable to use, so thermal throttling isn't really an issue I encountered. So it's a pretty efficient processor that they've chosen, which is great. That being said, when you first turn on the tablet, maybe it just takes a couple of extra seconds for it to first initialize compared to flagship grade devices, before then the performance becomes smoother later on. You have to wait just a beat longer when you first turn it on, but once it has woken up, metaphorically speaking, the performance does seem to be actually a little bit better than expected. Plus, if you're using it more conservatively with the brightness lowered, maybe sometimes you have wireless turned off, you can see how with standby time it can last even longer. So thankfully this is a tablet I had no issues with when it came to endurance, taking on the road, and using, and for lighter users it will easily stretch into at least a couple of days, 2 or 3, before you really have to recharge it again. Now in terms of the built-in storage, 128 gigabytes are built in, further expandable via that micro SD card slot, which is not bad. And under display properties, you can find a separate tab for contrast and color. It actually comes with a default more neutral colorway versus a medium contrast and a high contrast that makes things pop maybe a little bit more as an accessibility function. And then further scrolling down, you can turn on or off the 90 Hz refresh rate mode to save on battery, or if you want extra smoothness when scrolling. Boost also includes a handful of their custom wallpapers, again, that gives me, interestingly enough, some of those aforementioned Sony Xperia vibes. Very contrasty. So here's a couple of other examples just to serve as reference. Again, really not a bad looking display at all for a budget tablet, I have to say. Otherwise, if we jump into some of these other menu items, you can see it is going to be very faithful to stock Android. So they have kept it quite clean. Of course, you can choose between on-screen button navigation method or gesture navigation, also working quite nicely. Again, using the Android 15 operating system, having support for split-screen multitasking, and swiping up here to see the full list of apps. Again, quite similar to something like a Google Pixel tablet. Animations here feeling pretty smooth. That being said, one thing to keep in mind is like most other entry-level kind of budget phones and tablets for that matter as well, we don't necessarily anticipate there being too many OS level upgrades past the current version it's running on. Of course, right now it is fully up to date, the latest version of Android that you can find, but down the road, just something to keep in mind, would always like to see longer term software support, although firmware updates and security updates will still be provided over to the tablet. Moving into some specific apps next, let's begin with the camera. The UI here is pretty easy to operate, kind of like a blown up version of a smartphone. You're able to record video as well if you wanted to in a pinch, up to full HD resolution. In addition to here on photo, we can play around with an AI scene detection mode that will change the properties of the photo like color and contrast, depending on if you're pointing at food versus text versus animals, or you can find some more manual scene filters to further play around with instead of editing in post. Aspect ratio can also be changed, and the flash there, LED, can be turned on off. And of course, we can find the usual tap to focus, changing the exposure settings. We can also swipe over to the portrait mode that will use the depth sensing camera to give you that simulated bokeh effect, making the foreground here out of focus, giving you that separation similar to a larger sensor camera, but again, simulated using software. But you can change the virtual aperture here to make it more or less out of focus, as you can tell here on the side with the lamp. Actually not too bad. Under more, you can capture also time-lapse video, slow motion, and motion photos as well. Reviewing some of these quick snaps, I would say the overall camera quality and performance for a tablet is actually slightly above average in terms of color and contrast, thanks to the HDR processing here as well. You can actually get some pleasing looking colors as well as details, even if you're zooming and cropping in a little bit more on this large and expansive 11-inch display. So doing a little bit better than expected, to be completely honest, again on a tablet. Now, that being said, there is no telephoto zoom lens, so if you wanted to crop in more, it's done digitally, and you will lose a little bit more detail the further in you go. And also keep in mind that in lower light conditions, it may struggle a little bit more in terms of not having optical image stabilization. Also expected, I would say, for a $200 tablet, especially since I think most folks might not be using a tablet as their primary camera, so you have to hold relatively still when capturing in lower light. But the takeaway is for scanning in text details, it is more than usable enough, actually performing even slightly better than expected. So actually quite good. Also, if you're using it for quick video calls and conferences, it's going to be more than sufficient. Here's that shot that we also captured just moments ago. Again, the edge detection also seems to be doing all right for the simulated portrait mode. And now moving to a demo of web browsing. As aforementioned, connectivity via 5G is actually quite fast when it comes to loading back pages, so you can browse comfortably regardless of if you have Wi-Fi available or not. And in this particular instance, The Verge is a very complex site, plenty of scrolling elements as well as videos and some smaller ads embedded on the page, but as you can tell, it's actually loading up almost instantly when we jumped into this site. It's actually doing a little bit better than expected. Now we can jump into some other pages here, and once again, the 5G connectivity has been quite reliable. Now again, the 4 gigabytes of RAM though is probably the one aspect that might be a little bit more limiting if you're opening up dozens and dozens of pages and you expect the browser to keep it all in the memory when you jump back and forth. In my testing though, using around 5 to 6 tabs, it was still able to remember things and it didn't really have to refresh or reload when I went back and forth. But if I open up again over 10 tabs, that's when things would start to reshuffle a little bit, taking a split second because the, again, RAM is set there at 4 gigs. So I think there is opportunity here for maybe a Pro model down the line that could be increased to something like 8 gigabytes of RAM. That would be nice to see for more power users. However, it still is going to be, I would say, more than sufficient as a entry-level tablet. Accelerometer here also working quite nicely. Pinch to zoom still feels pretty fluid and responsive. So all in all, really not bad when it comes to the overall usability. Now again, we're able to jump into the multitasking view here as well. If we wanted to, for example, split it into 2 sides, we can open up the browser as well as maybe watch a video simultaneously. And it still seems to be doing an okay job here as well. You can resize the windows here left and right to take advantage of the larger, again, nearly 11-inch screen size. And now also moving into a demo of video playback, again streaming over 5G, still is quite fast with no real buffering. Everything loads up almost instantly when we click on a YouTube video. Alright, so turning the volume down there, takeaway is the speakers also get surprisingly loud. However, for a thinner tablet, of course, it's not going to pack the most depth in terms of bass, sounding a little bit more piercing there at the higher end, but still good enough for general quick content consumption on YouTube with that stereo separation, or again, connecting to standard headphones, Bluetooth wireless headphones, or speakers are also supported. Working quite smoothly, even with 5G streaming here at the moment, again, encountering no real issues. So a pretty solid entertainment experience overall. Again, even if we're fast forwarding, scrubbing between parts of the video, the 5G is still helping things stay connected without much buffering or delays to speak of. Contrast looking a little bit more rich than I was expecting, again, for a budget tablet, rivaling maybe some of the offerings from Xiaomi as part of their Mi Pad that is more popular internationally, and seems to be a slight step up compared to the panel found on something like the Amazon Fire Tab, even the Max 11 that we saw recently as well. The fit and finish here seems to be even a little bit more tight and premium, again with the added water resistance rating. Again, the panel being fully laminated with a faster refresh rate as well all help contribute to a slightly more premium feeling experience, despite it still being an entry-level tablet. Again, as long as you have reasonable expectations, it's actually doing a little bit better than expected. Of course, if you're playing back more AAA style games, like for example Asphalt, PUBG, Minecraft, and you're opening up those games at the highest graphic settings, then it's still going to see some micro stutters every now and then. That is when compared with higher-end flagship-grade devices with a faster GPU primarily. But for casual titles like Stack, as you can tell here, puzzle-type games, if you're keeping things a little bit more light, it still feels like a responsive enough experience. And really, there are no apps from the Google Play Store that you aren't able to install on here when it comes to, again, casual gaming, as well as social media, web browsing, watching back videos, media consumption. Likewise, the larger screen size makes it relatively comfortable if you're trying to engage with documents, including PDFs, as well as checking out comics, doing some light reading as well, especially with that 90Hz refresh rate screen remaining quite enjoyable. And for a 11-inch tablet, it doesn't feel too heavy either. So holding it for sessions like 30 minutes, maybe even up to an hour, it's not going to feel too stressful either as you are using the device. So if interested, you can check out more details in the links down below. Again, could be a nice choice if you're looking for a cellular-enabled tablet that has that 5G connectivity. Of course, there's nothing stopping you from using it with Wi-Fi only, but this just makes it a little bit more versatile, plus with the eSIM support, if you wanted to use it when on the go, and also for times when Wi-Fi might not be available. All of this is wrapped in a display, as well as a very clean version of Android 15 overall in terms of the UI that definitely makes it feel a little bit more premium than the price would imply. So feel free to learn more details down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Boost Mobile Celero 5G Android tablet.